Well, welcome back to the Point of Order podcast, an inside look at California politics in the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover. We're in a new episode, obviously a new year and a new studio this year. So lots of fun stuff for the Point of Order podcast coming this year. And also, not new, we have a familiar guest on the show with us today, Tom Sheehy, founder of Sheehy Strategy Group. Tom, welcome back to the program.
Josh, thank you very much. It's great to be with you, and thanks for the invitation to come back.
Absolutely. And, you know, you're becoming a regular guest like twice a year here, because today we're talking about the budget.
It must be budget time.
Yeah, exactly. So we want Tom's name to be, considered when you think about the budget. We gotta break down the budget, and that obviously is the big story right now. There are some other major stories we're going to get into before that as well. But the budget obviously being announced on Friday, January 10th, last Friday, and a lot to break down when it comes to that. Before we get into that, and before we get into our stories of the week, I don't know. It's a new year, so I wanted to ask you have any New Year's resolutions this year? And if you do, how are they going so far for you?
You know, it's the same old, same old. I want to try to get more exercise, drop some extra pounds. My doc said that's important. And I want to just try to be nice to other people as much as I can, be more patient, have more compassion. And
I like that one. That's a good one.
I think it's just that. And if I can keep that for at least the first quarter of the new year, then I think I'm
that's a win.
Ahead of the game. And before I forget, Josh, I just want to say, truly, you are my member of the Assembly. You're my and my wife's Assemblyman. And we want to congratulate you in winning what looked to be a very tight race. And you actually won it with more votes than a lot of us thought you would. But we voted for you, and we're happy that you're back in Sacramento.
Well, I appreciate that, and very glad to be back. I think a lot of important work still ahead, obviously. And just glad to be out of that season of things and into the season where we can really get to work at the Capitol and in the district, doing what I think people need. So I appreciate that, though. Appreciate that very much. I actually didn't give you a second. If you want to remind people of your background, by the way, and, kind of where all this budget expertise came from, please feel free.
Sure. So very, very, very quickly, because I don't want to put your audience to sleep. I did spend a number of years on the inside of state government, and 10 of those years were in the executive branch. And Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Finance, which I served in his second term. Prior to that, I was a budget analyst at Department of Finance when I first started my career. I didn't go from being a budget analyst to chief deputy. In between, I spent 9 years in the legislature, staffing senior leadership. And then I left state government altogether, worked for a Fortune 100 financial services company. And then it was after the recall when I got recruited back in to work for Governor Schwarzenegger. So that's, I think, between sort of working in the trenches as an analyst and really doing the nitty-gritty part of it, as well as working in their executive office, advising the governor directly when we were going through the Great Recession. I think that's how I really got an appreciation for both the details as well as the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
When I left the Schwarzenegger administration, I went to work at a big international law firm for about 8 years. I'm not a lawyer, but they brought me in to help on their government affairs. And then I left amicably, took a couple of clients, and started my own practice about 6.5 years ago, the Sheehy Strategy Group.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And just to get back to our other conversation, I guess I have to share my New Year's resolutions, which I don't really have very many. But the first one is to survive dry January. So I can proudly say that it has been 13 days, and I'm still sticking to it. So we're almost halfway there.
I want to know how much weight you lose as a result of that.
I'll let you know at the end of the month. It is amazing, not only weight, or just calories, right, intake, but also just like the money you save, not buying drinks.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So trying to get through that. And then, obviously some of the other health ones, like you mentioned. And then I want to read more books this year. I read a embarrassingly low amount of books in 2024. Mostly because we do so much reading. I mean, I read all the time, right? But it's always news stories and kind of what's going on in current events. And so trying to set aside a little more time to just read or listen to a book. I'm a big audiobook guy too. So, we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I'm almost through book 1 already, and it's January 13th, so that's not bad.
Excellent.
All right, so let's dive into our stories of the week. Look, we'll get to the budget discussion in a little bit here, but I think the big story, obviously, as this is the first show of the year, and really an incredible way to start a year is the devastating wildfires that are happening, the devastating fires that are happening in Southern California right now. I think most of us, and I know, I have a lot of colleagues with friends, family, colleagues that live down there too. It's just devastating what is happening in Los Angeles right now. I think it is going to go down as one of the bigger natural disasters in the history of California. I don't know if you had any thoughts on the fires themselves before we dive into some of the story, but yeah.
Sure, thank you. Well, just like many of your colleagues and I'm sure staff and others, I've got friends and family in Southern California. I grew up down in the Pasadena area. I've got one classmate who lost their home in Pacific Palisades. I've got two different sets of friends who were evacuated from Altadena. Fortunately, both of their houses were spared, but they're unlivable right now because of the stench that exists both inside the house and outside the house. I have an elderly mother on the border between San Marino and Pasadena who came pretty close to the voluntary evacuation zone, and she was just freaked out about that. And I have a mother-in-law in Santa Monica that was within 1 block of the voluntary evacuation zone. So it did affect me personally. I just want to say for all of the folks that are listening that know people or have been affected, my wife and I have been praying for everybody impacted, and we're really heartbroken over the devastation. I will tell you that I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. I think there's some real failed leadership that we have to take a hard look at, and hopefully we will make changes going forward in terms of the infrastructure that is down in that part of California subject to these winds to make sure that when a fire starts again, we have all the tools necessary, all the water necessary, all the water pressure necessary to minimize its impact. I want to just say one more thing. I fully understand that once that fire started, it was going to be really hard to put out, but there were things that made it worse than it needed to be.
Absolutely. No, 100% agree. So far right now, as of today, and this was an article from this morning, we have Los Angeles, 24 people have passed away due to the fire. The count is up to 24. I think it was 10 just a few days ago. So there's obviously still a number of other people displaced or missing. Over 12,000 structures have been destroyed. And to your point, I think it's a good one. There were obviously things out of our control in the situation, such as the winds. Obviously there were natural parts of this that were going to be difficult to deal with. But there were a lot of leadership challenges too. I mean, I think, there's a story in LA Times about the fire hydrant pressure not being able to keep up with the demand that the firefighters needed. We had, a number of other challenges at the local level with response times, people not being able to get help or get out in time. A lot of things that in retrospect, you're going to go back and hopefully plan for, something better in the future. I don't know if you heard about the alert that they sent, the evacuation alert that they sent. I was blown away by this. So there was a mistake made in the LA County Emergency Management Department where they sent out an alert to every resident in LA County to evacuate. Now, I believe they did correct that eventually.
25 minutes later.
25 minutes later, they sent it, but it was supposed to go to targeted regions where the danger was. It went to every resident in LA County. I'm sure struck fear in every resident in LA County. I had colleagues on, X frantically tweeting if they represented those areas, like, this was a mistake. These are the counties that were impacted, but it just created a whole nother scramble on top of what they were already having to deal with, and just example after example of failed leadership. And I think, a lot that needs to be assessed after the fact for sure. Interestingly, at the same time, we're waiting on all of these policy committees to be announced, and the Senate had announced all theirs last week. I think what has to be talked about is not just the fire and the people impacted in the immediate term, but the insurance issues, right? The insurance, some insurance companies dropped a number of claims not too long ago in this area because of the risk and because of failed California policies that didn't allow them to keep up with their costs. That is going to be I think even outside of the wildfire issue, that is going to be a crisis all in its own that we're going to need to deal with as well.
Listen, I think you and your colleagues are going to spend a lot of time this year talking about it. You're right. For your listeners that don't know, there were thousands of homes whose insurance they were notified by. I'm not going to call the companies out because they're not bad guys. They're just protecting their assets so they can pay claims. But you had major insurance companies whose names we'd all know that terminated thousands of residents in the Pacific Palisades area last summer. So, 6 months ahead of time. Most all of those folks then had no choice but to go to what's called the FAIR Plan, which is a quasi-state private insurance policy that is really the insurance of last resort. It's very expensive, and its benefits are not particularly good compared to private insurance. And I'm not an insurance expert, but I've been reading some articles by people that are, and they're very concerned about the solvency of the FAIR Plan. And there's going to be unfortunately, there's going to be a rippling effect from this fire as it relates to further decisions insurance companies have to make as it relates to writing policies in California in this market. This has implications not only to homeowners and protecting their assets, but to the real estate industry, because you can't sell a house if you can't insure it.
Yep.
So I think that despite the special session that was called, which I think we may talk about later, the real special session ought to be what's going on with the fires, insurance, and what we can do to make California more livable given the guns we got pointed at us right now.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get into that right now. I think the one interesting fact about that I was going to mention is that the Senate currently doesn't have a Senate insurance chair of the policy committee because of this corruption probe that's going on. And so, there's just all of these things colliding all at once. And I won't dive too much into that story on this podcast, but we'll put the story in the show notes if you want to read more about that. But it's just an incredible, it's just incredible how all these things are happening at the same time. But to your point about the special session, let's talk about that because I agree with you 100%. In fact, I tweeted last week, we need a special session on fires. We need a special session on the insurance crisis. We can make it one session, but we need to do that immediately. And actually on Saturday, my colleagues and I sent a letter to the governor calling on him to call that session. We will actually be doing a press conference later today. We're recording this on a Monday. So 100% agree with that. Interestingly, we are currently in a special session. It is a special session focused on essentially fighting the hypothetical policies coming out of the incoming administration that's not even in office yet. And they actually struck a deal on that, I believe, yesterday to basically spend $50 million taxpayer dollars on essentially hiring lawyers to fight the incoming administration and also for legal services for illegal immigrants. Look, and I said it on X last week, and I think my colleagues and I will be emphasizing this today. To me, that is all about playing politics. That is about the governor kind of positioning himself maybe for some future presidential aspirations, but it's not the things that we should be focused on as a state. It's not the things that, especially while LA is burning, we need to be focused on helping the people in our state. And I think that is where we need to shift our focus.
May I comment on that, Josh? So I agree with everything you said, and I'm glad that you and your colleagues are going to pressure the governor to start a special session on fires and insurance. Far more important. With respect to the special session that the governor called for and that the legislature has now started or entered into, I'm just going to speak to the facts. And you know this as well as I do because you're a legislator.
Yeah.
There was no legislation that could be introduced, heard, amended, or passed and sent to the governor coming out of that special session that couldn't be done in the regular session.
True.
None. And you could put an urgency clause on it, and it would take effect immediately. And you could appropriate as much money as you wanted to in a bill if you needed to. At this time of the year, the Department of Justice isn't running out of money. They've got plenty of money to pay their lawyers to litigate against the federal government if that's what they want to do. So I will say that on the facts of it, in terms of how government works, completely unnecessary. And it looks to me and others who are a lot smarter than I am, it's just a pure political stunt.
And I think that's what's frustrating, especially for a lot of voters, right? And for a lot of constituents is I think we're tired of the political stunts, and we just want to see our government working for the people, and actually working to solve the problems. California's got a lot of problems. I definitely don't think that should be the focus. So, shifting gears a little bit here, some new changes. Obviously, I mentioned the committee chair issue. We're going to have a new public safety chair in the coming year. This is in the assembly. I should qualify that. This is the third different public safety chair we've had in 3 years. And so it's kind of been for people that have policies in that committee. I've introduced a few things over the last few years. It's kind of been this carousel, right? And so I look forward to meeting with the new public safety chair soon. It is actually Nick Schultz, who is a new member of the assembly, who has been, he's in Southern California. And so I'm really interested to see Assemblyman Schultz's approach to public safety. From the interactions I've had with him, which have been pretty brief so far, seems like a very reasonable guy. But I'll be meeting with him soon to really talk about what is his beliefs on public safety policy in California, and how are we going to go about making sure we're holding people accountable for the crimes they're committing. So
Assemblyman Schultz is the former mayor of Burbank, so he comes from a local government background. And interestingly, when I was taking a look at this before your show, I see that he worked at the Department of Justice, the state of California Department of Justice, as a prosecutor.
Deputy Attorney General. Yeah.
Deputy Attorney General. So that, on the one hand, you think, well, that's great. I did see one thing that gave me some pause, and that's that he played a pivotal role in creating the post-conviction review unit, whose whole purpose is to look at felons that have been convicted and try to figure out whether they should have been convicted and whether they should have a reduced sentence or be freed. Now, everybody deserves all their rights under the law, but I don't really want prosecutors specializing in trying to figure out whether, now we've convicted you, let's try to figure out, do you really need, was it really the right thing to do?
Yeah.
I hope that his approach to the Public Safety Committee is more concerned about victims than on the perpetrators.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think the problem with our Public Safety Committee the last number of years has been that has not been the focus, right? And we really saw that almost the Californians revolt against that a bit in this last election cycle by passing Proposition 36, which really, the goal was restoring accountability to our criminal justice system. And I think we do this a lot, not just in California, but just everywhere in politics, where we just swing from, pendulum to pendulum, and we never really find that healthy middle ground, where, for years we had very strong public safety penalties and higher prison populations and less crime. And then we shifted away from a lot of that and got the reverse of that, right? And I think Proposition 36 is going to help bring us more back towards the middle there. On that note, Proposition 36 is having an immediate impact. And I don't think I put it in your notes, but I think it's actually an article from this morning about how, at least in my area, Sacramento County, Placer County, El Dorado County, prosecutors are immediately using Proposition 36, which went into effect a few weeks ago, to charge felonies for serious thieves, crimes. And so,
may I comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I did see that article, and I think what's really important about it is it's not just that they can charge felonies, but that gives them leverage with the offenders to get them into drug treatment.
Yeah,
because they
100%.
can reduce the felony to a misdemeanor. They can eliminate any jail time if the defendant who has been caught with dangerous drugs, fentanyl, heroin, what have you, agree to go into treatment. And while treatment isn't going to fix everything, it's a heck of a lot better than simply giving them a slap on the wrist and putting them back on the street without any accountability.
100%.
So I think what I'm going to call a drug court now, it's what we used to have,
right,
and saying, look, you can either go spend, 6 months in jail, or you can go into a 3-month treatment program. I think that's a good place for us to be. And I think most people will elect to do the treatment.
Absolutely. And so Jeff Reisig actually made that exact comment in the story today. He's the Yolo County District Attorney who was a big proponent of Prop 36 for this very reason. He actually has shared his personal story. He has family that is homeless, right? That he believes this is going to help that person get back on the right track, because under the previous framework, there was no push to go into treatment. There was no push to require that you get your life back on track, and that is why a lot of people continued along the status quo. And so he made a comment today that it's going exactly as they hoped, where they've sent a lot of cases. Instead of charging the felony, basically negotiated that down to a treatment program for the individuals that committed these crimes. And hopefully over time, that will lead to a lot more people getting their lives back on track.
I sure hope so.
On that note, another thing that hopefully it'll lead to is, potentially a reduction over time in homelessness in California, right? Because I think a lot of these things are tied together. And so the point in time count came out in the last month or so. For 2024, we saw a 3% increase again in homelessness. Now, that was a smaller increase than we have seen in previous years. And it was, to the governor's, I think the governor made some point about this. It was one of the smaller increases in the country. But I think that's a little bit unfair to say when you already have 50% of the nation's homelessness in your state, which totals, I think it's something around 187,000 people now. That is in itself, a huge challenge that California has to figure out. And that's been one of my big focuses in my last 2 years, and will continue to be. So
$24 billion
yeah,
we've spent. It's unbelievable. And if you look at, I think the statistic was, when you look at the number of people that were homeless as of the census, 172,000. It's grown since then.
Yep.
If you just do the math, that's $42,000 per homeless person that we've spent. $42,000, that's a lot of money. And the problem is getting worse. So
yeah, and it's still an increase, right?
Yeah.
While it is a smaller increase, 3% up from the year before, when we've seen it go up every year for the last 10 years almost. It's a huge problem. So.
You and your colleagues and the governor certainly still have their work cut out for them. And by the way, thank you for being for accountability on how the money's being spent. We want to make sure that the money is being spent on programs that are actually helping people get healthier and get off the street. And I agree with you. I think the impact of Prop 36 in the long term will have a downward pressure on homelessness, because it should get people off of drugs. And most people that are homeless, not all, but most, have issues with drugs and, of course, with mental health.
Yeah, and so that is the goal, and so it'll be interesting. Yeah, my office is gonna be doing some more work on that, following up on our audit of homelessness spending, trying to dive deeper into requiring more accountability, both at the state and at the local level, because there's a lot of money being spent at the local level that we don't know where it's going either. So we'll be announcing some of that in coming weeks. I think we'll end the stories of the week there. The one little note I wanted to make. These two big lawsuits to start the year. It's just stories to watch, maybe, right? So the legislature passed SB 549 last year that gave tribes in California standing to sue cardrooms in court over what they claim is illegal gambling. And so that lawsuit was filed pretty much immediately upon the court's opening in the new year. That will be an interesting one to watch and see how that plays out. That is an issue that has a lot of facets to it that I'm not going to dive into right now, but that could have a major impact on the world of gaming this year. And for anyone listening that's like, a teenager, I'm not talking about video games. We're talking about gambling.
You're talking about card room. You're talking about Indian sanctioned casinos. And then their fight with the card rooms.
Correct. Yeah. So that and then the other big lawsuit was a number of business groups are suing the state of California over a new law that put a lot of limits on their free speech in terms of what meetings they can hold with their employees and what they're able to talk about with their employees. It's something that they're very concerned about moving forward, and that really some of the goal behind it was to basically make it easier to unionize more workers in California. That is another lawsuit that's going to be going through the courts this year that will be one to watch.
I just want to make one very quick comment on the Indian litigation against the card rooms. I should say the tribes. It's very complicated, as you said, many facets to that. But I would just make this one observation. Many card rooms spin off a lot of tax revenue. In some local jurisdictions, it can be as much as 50% of their general fund budget, believe it or not. So if the tribes are successful in putting these card rooms out of business, which is what this is about, I hope that they're willing to step up and backfill all the revenue that would have been going to these cities, because it's going to be a lot of policemen and a lot of firemen that are going to lose their jobs, and then who are going to protect those constituents. Those are the stakes. It's not just about who's, obviously tribes, have been granted the right as sovereign nations to have the gambling, but the card rooms believe they're operating lawfully too. I don't have any clients in this area, but I'm not an expert. But I'm just
outside
saying,
opinion.
But I just know that a lot of that tax revenue that comes out of those card rooms goes to local governments, and they need that money for fire, police, and other municipal services.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a big part of the conversation because, I mean, to your point, it's actually, I didn't really realize this until a couple years ago that you're right. Some cities actually, like 30 to 50% of the revenue comes from like these operations, which is really hard for me to even imagine in my mind. So my district has, a few of them as well, but nowhere near the reliance, right, that some of these districts in Southern California have. So it's really incredible.
Just real quickly on the WAHB legislation, SB 399. The entire business, I've got one of my clients is a business trade association, and the entire business community opposed this bill. They all thought it was the Chamber of Commerce led the opposition and said they thought it was a really bad infringement upon employers' First Amendment right of speech, interfering with the federal National Labor Relations Act. A lot of people think this was done because they were concerned about Trump becoming president again. It'd be a less friendly administration in Washington.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the motivation was, is a bad bill. I don't know how to determine predict the success of the litigation, but I sure hope that these issues of free speech and employers' rights to talk to their employees, I should say, gets fully vetted in the courts, and that there's a decision that doesn't just stifle employers' ability to communicate. I think that would be a terrible thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great thought as well. Speaking of free speech, I mean, this is just the perfect transition because before we get into the budget, I wanted to play you our clip of the week.
Okay.
And I thought this was fascinating. So many people, just to set it up a little bit, may have heard about Meta. It's weird for me to call it Meta because I want to call it Facebook, but Meta's announcement that Facebook is actually going to be changing how they moderate content on their platform. They're going to be, essentially getting rid of their fact checkers, which they have used for a number of years, and moving to a community note style system the way X moderates their content. Now, I will just say off the top, I'm on Facebook, I'm on X. I prefer X, if I'm being honest, but that's just, I know a lot of people have different opinions on that. But the X platform and the community notes, none of these systems are perfect. And I think everyone would agree to that. But this idea that you have the community moderating content, and it really helps, I think, what I think should be the ideal for these companies, which is to err on the side of free speech, right? There's no way to create a perfect system for moderating content, but the fact-checking system, there is no doubt in my mind that tends to censor more speech, whereas the community note system, in a lot of cases, doesn't censor speech. It simply adds to the discussion, right? And I think allows people to err on the side of more speech, which I think is the right approach. And so I was fascinated by that announcement. Following that announcement, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Meta and Facebook, went on the Rogan podcast last week and kind of talked more in detail about what led to this decision. So I wanted to play this clip for you and then get your reaction.
When they were trying to roll out the vaccine program. And I'm generally pretty pro rolling out vaccines. I think on balance, the vaccines are more positive than negative. But I think that while they're trying to push that program, they also tried to censor anyone who is basically arguing against it. And they pushed us super hard to take down things that were honestly were true, right? I mean, they basically pushed us and said, anything that says that vaccines might have side effects, you basically need to take down. And I was just like, well, we're not going to do that. We're clearly not going to do that. I mean, that is kind of inarguably
who
true.
is they? Who's telling you to take down things that
It was
that talk
people.
about vaccine side effects?
It was people in the Biden administration. I think it was I wasn't involved in those conversations directly, but I think it was.
How difficult is that to not be involved in those conversations?
So, that clip there, I think very eye-opening to me because, there's been a lot of talk for a long time that there was a lot of censorship during the pandemic, right? But this idea that companies obviously are not bound by the First Amendment in the same way that the government is. And so if a company is engaging in this activity, then you can call it objectionable and choose maybe not to patron that company or that platform. But it is within their right to do it. But when the government is pressuring that company to censor speech, that creates a whole new area of legal concern. And so, to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, who was running Meta during the pandemic and very involved and aware of what was going on there, it's really bad. He actually talks in a separate part of the podcast that, they would call up and they would yell at the Meta people that they had to take certain things down. And they would threaten, which is the even bigger problem, threaten regulation and scrutiny over Meta in a greater way in response if they chose not to follow those instructions. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this gets dealt with in the courts. But that really is, I think, a huge problem that led Zuckerberg to really change the way he approaches Facebook.
Look, I think the yelling and threatening is completely out of line. I think Zuckerberg would be better off if he named names, because right now he's just making accusations. He's not really saying who was yelling and threatening, other than they were folks in the Biden administration.
Sure.
But I would just say, as somebody, again, who's not an expert in this area, but I think that any heavy-handed censorship by government, state government or federal government, is completely anathema to what our country stands for, free speech. And I'm glad this is coming out. I hope the ultimate impact of it is positive. And I'm really glad that Zuckerberg is aligning himself more with X than with other platforms so that we can have more free speech and not less.
Yeah, 100%. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes the dynamics of Facebook. I think it'll ultimately be good for the platform, but it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. So let's get into the big topic for today, which is why you're here and stuff that you love to talk about, which is the state budget. I obviously have a lot of notes and there's a lot of directions that we can go, but just to give a little overview, the total state spending announced in the governor's budget on Friday was a $322.3 billion budget, which is a $24.3 billion increase over last year's Budget Act. The total budget, if you include federal funding, is almost $500 billion. So we're talking about a lot of money here. And there was a number of things in it that they highlighted on Friday, the governor's team. I should say the governor's team, because this is the first time since I can remember in a long time that the governor himself was not actually introducing the budget. He had a press conference about a week ago to kind of preview the budget, and then he was, I believe, at President Carter's funeral, and so decided not to be present at the actual budget announcement on January 10th, which is the deadline. And so his team highlighted a number of different things. And so I'll just bring these up and we can go in any direction else that we want.
Sure.
Obviously, long-term budgetary concerns. They really highlighted that. I think they initially said that 10,000 state jobs were going to need to be cut. That number has dropped down to 6,500. They highlighted this new diaper initiative, $20 million to provide a 3-month supply of diapers to families in California. This is a big one, I thought. Creation of 2 new state agencies, which generally speaking, I raise my eyebrow at that, and I'm definitely curious to learn more about these, but the creation of the California Housing and Homelessness Agency and the Consumer Protection Agency, 2 things that sound very good, right? But the devil is always in the details, and especially when it comes to homelessness. It's hard for me to believe that the solution to that is more government. Mm-hmm. And we have seen the government solutions, quote unquote solutions, grow. Mm-hmm. increased in number over these last few years, and we've seen homelessness increase in number, and so that's a concern. And then getting the state to rely more heavily on artificial intelligence, which I think is an interesting topic, and then also a doubling of the California film and television tax credit, which again, films are great, that's wonderful, but a budget's all about trade-offs. It's all about opportunity costs. It's all about what are you funding that you're now not funding, right? Because we have a limited amount of resources in a year where, and I'll ask you this question too, how this budget might change in the next few months. But in a year where we have these devastating fires happening, where we have a number of other things that are impacting the cost for residents in our state, are these the priorities we should be focused on? So give us your take kind of on the budget as a whole and what your kind of initial thoughts are.
Thanks, Josh. I think all of the budget points and issues you raise are all really good, and some of them we can talk about in more detail. We can come back to the creation of those new agencies. I have a couple thoughts on that, but what I think would be helpful for your listeners, since we're not going to make anybody a budget expert on every little detail of the budget, is to sort of stick to the big picture for a moment. And if I were you and in caucus and somebody were to say, what do you like about the budget? And this isn't just for Republicans, it could be for Democrats as well. There's several things here I think you could say that are good about this budget. We're talking about the budget that starts July 1st. It will be the 25-26 fiscal year. There are no new general tax increases in the budget. That's a good thing. They're not proposing to suspend Prop 98 in the current year or in the budget year. You were asked to suspend it for the past year. You had to vote on that, but you're not going to be asked to, at least not at this time, suspend Prop 98. There's enough money to fund a COLA for the local control funding formula. That's a good thing. So all the school districts, in schools in your district and in other areas around the state will be getting their COLA. And if you look at the 3-year budget forecast, the past year, current year, and budget year, and compare it to where we were a year ago, or compare it to the May revise, I should say, what was adopted, what you voted on, there's $17 billion more revenue than what we thought just 6-7 months ago. Those are all, and that's without tax increases, so those are good things. What's not so good, I'll give you the other side of that equation now. The LAO came out with their fiscal update just about a month before this budget was released. And so they were working off all the same data, facts, and figures that the administration worked on to come out with the governor's budget last week. And they said that looking at the budget year, 25-26, just assuming no changes in current law, it was close to being balanced. They said there was about a $2 billion deficit, which in the grand scheme of things is nothing. I mean, you were looking at anywhere from 50 to 70 billion last year. However, if you think about it for a second, part of the governor's budget plan assumes that $7 billion comes out of the budget stabilization account, or what we call the rainy day fund. $7 billion comes out in the budget year. So really, if you didn't do that, it's a $9 billion hole. And then the governor's budget, no fault of his, but just because of timing, doesn't include any of the costs, which could be $1 billion or more, $1 billion or more, associated with the response and recovery to all of these fires happening in Southern California. So it's not too hard to all of a sudden you're in a double-digit billion-dollar budget problem when you start July 1st, assuming that you don't make any changes. Now, of course, you and your colleagues on both sides of the aisle are going to be debating this all year, and you're going to make lots of changes so that you can avoid that. But to simply say the budget is balanced is sort of, I think, I don't think that that's the most accurate way of assessing the situation. The other thing the LAO said is that we have a problem. You remember last year, some of your audience got a kick out of it. I talked about the fish mouth. And my old boss, Governor Schwarzenegger, said, "You've got to close the fish mouth." Well, it's the same thing. You've got the expenditures here, and you've got the revenues, which are my lower hand. And if the curve of those two lines looks like this, it looks like a fish mouth, and they don't ever meet. And what the LAO said is our long-term spending right now is approximately 6% year-over-year growth. Mm-hmm. Our long-term revenues right now is approximately 4% year-over-year revenue growth. So if the revenue growth is 4% in the long term under current law, and the expenditure growth is 6%, you'll never close the fish mouth, ever.
Yeah.
And it means that you have to make real reductions in spending. Now, in last year's budget, you did a lot of deferrals, fund shifts, other things that, from an accounting standpoint, balanced the budget, but didn't actually address that 6% year-over-year growth. And so the basic underpinnings of this budget really, really concern me, and I think should concern all of the legislature. The other thing the analyst said is that when you get into the out years, so this would be budget year plus one, which is 26, 27 fiscal year, all things being equal, they're saying it's a $20 billion deficit. Budget year plus two, which is the 27, 28 fiscal year, it goes up to $25 billion. And the following year, which is the last year in their forecast, 28, 29, $30 billion. Now, you're not going to solve that with accounting gimmicks and fund shifts and borrowing from other programs. There's going to have to be either more revenue added to the equation or less spending or both. And I don't really think that you and your colleagues and the governor have made a lot of hard choices. Yeah, they probably think they have. But when you look at what's coming,
They haven't yet.
they really haven't yet.
Yeah.
So those would be some
point.
of the things that I'm concerned about. I will just say a couple of other things that, it's not the governor's fault, but there is no budget resources in here for more water infrastructure by means of what we could be using for fighting to make sure that the hydrants have enough pressure and other supplies associated. And in fairness to the governor, there was no way he could have assumed that going into the budget. And then one more thing. Governor Newsom made a big deal by saying he's going to force his government to be more efficient. In the budget last year, in the current year and budget year, he implemented $5 billion in efficiencies, and they scored $5 billion in solutions in the budget by making state government more efficient, coming out of state operations. The analysts said in their November update that based upon everything the Department of Finance had shared with them, and it's the Department of Finance that's in charge of making those budget adjustments, those efficiencies, they said they couldn't find any indication of what those efficiencies were.
Wow.
Or that they were happening.
So, and you said it was $5 billion?
Yeah, that was
It was
over the
supposed
current
to be
year.
$5 billion.
Current year, last year's budget, what
Wow.
you adopted was
Okay.
current year was 2.2, and then they said an additional 2.8 ongoing in the budget year. So if you add that together, it's $5 billion.
Right.
Well, this budget in front of you, they're still sticking with this budget efficiencies, but they've dialed it way back. Now they're saying over the 2-year budget, current year budget, it'll be $3.5 billion in budget efficiencies. But what's troubling here is, regardless of what the number is, everybody wants government to be more efficient. But the executive, the governor, and the executive branch needs to be able to tell you, as an appropriator, what are they going to cut? Where are these?
What are the efficiencies?
What is it they're not going to do tomorrow that they're doing today that's going to save money? And does it make the delivery of services better? Is it going to cause backlogs in important programs? Are my constituents going to be held on hold 10 minutes later? Or is it just going to mean that computers are going to work more efficiently with better software and better I mean, we don't know. You don't know. The Legislative Analyst's Office, which is probably the biggest budget geek in Sacramento, they don't know.
Yeah,
Not that concerns
that's a
me.
huge problem for
That
sure.
concerns me. Then I would just finally say, as sort of the big picture, it's a big budget, and it's a big general fund budget. The general fund alone is $225 billion. You're far better off today than you were a year ago. But I think that everybody's going to have to roll their sleeves up and do a lot of work because we are not out of the woods by any means.
So the governor's going to come out with his May revision obviously in May. And what are some of the things that you think will be the biggest changes that you would expect to see in that? Would it be the fires? Would it be, recovery and disaster response? And, I don't know if there's other categories there, but is that what you kind of expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the fire response is going to be huge, and that's going to grab a lot of the oxygen in the room, a lot of the headlines. We have to do better there, as we discussed at the beginning of this segment. I think also we need to really pay attention to the economy. I read some of the initial reports about the budget, and they say, the state's economy is doing better, so we have this big surge in revenue. And it depends on what sector you're in. The reality is, and I got this directly from the LAO, the LAO has stated in their update that the state of California hasn't created any new jobs in the last year and a half outside of government and the healthcare sector. So if you're talking construction, manufacturing, finance, these other important areas of our economy, they don't have any net new jobs, and it's been a rather sluggish economy. The reason why the revenues are higher right now, primarily, is because of the stock market and capital gains. And there are highly compensated employees, particularly down in Silicon Valley. They get a lot of stock options and bonus revenue, and when the stock market does well, they pay a lot in taxes. And within the technology sector, there's one particular company, NVIDIA. If you look at the Fortune 500 stock index and its performance over the last year, I think it's been up by almost
incredible.
20-something percent.
Yeah.
1/3 of that is due to one company,
Yeah.
NVIDIA. NVIDIA is the premier technology leader in artificial intelligence. So what am I saying here? You've got one company that's driving the stock market. The stock market is driving the compensation for driving the pay for highly compensated employees in California, and those people are driving the driving force behind this increase in revenue that everybody's talking about in Sacramento.
Yeah.
So that is a very narrow base of economy and where money's coming from. And if they get a cold, the state of California is going to get a severe case of influenza because the other sectors of our economy are just sort of plugging along, and they're not spinning off a bunch of extra revenue.
Well, I think that's the thing that gets lost so often when the governor talks about, our economy being the 5th largest in the world and, moving up the ladder in that regard, because it's all very precariously balanced on mostly the tech sector. But when you look at NVIDIA and by the way, they've broken records in terms of growth in the last year, and a lot of that driven by as a, essentially a company that makes chips for a lot of these artificial intelligence data centers and systems that are going to, processing power essentially for all this technology that's going to be coming online. And I do think that's going to continue to grow in 2025. We're going to see a huge jump and growth in robotics, artificial intelligence. All of that, in theory, should continue to go up. But the reality is, if for some reason it doesn't, there's a lot of other sectors, to your point, that aren't breaking records, that aren't doing well, that are really struggling with cost increases. I had a story I didn't bring up earlier. The price of eggs, right now it's like over $9 in California due to shortage and bird flu, and there's a number of other factors. But you get any sort of disruption like that in any of these sectors, and you very quickly find yourself in a different position.
Absolutely. I'm not predicting it, and I don't know if anybody is, but if there's a stock market correction between now and the May revision, that's going to have a huge impact. I think most of your listeners here are pretty educated about government. They've heard this, but I think it bears repeating. The reason why this NVIDIA, stock market, capital gains, it has such an impact on revenue. If you look at California's general fund budget, and when we're talking about balancing the budget, it's really that general fund budget, that $225 billion of general fund. The number you cited in the beginning of 325 was all fund sources, then you add in federal funds, it's even more. But when we're talking about balancing the budget, it's really the general fund.
Sure.
About somewhere between 65 and 70% of all the revenue that comes into the general fund budget comes from personal income taxes, withholding, estimated payments, capital gains, all the proceeds of taxes that go into the general fund, personal income tax. That's almost 70% of the general fund budget, okay? The other 30%, of course, being sales tax, corporate tax, and so on. Well, if you look at the sources of personal income tax that are in that 70%, the top 1% of taxpayers in the state of California, and they represent about 140,000 tax returns that get sent into the FTB. The top 1% are accountable or attributable or represent 50% of that personal income tax money that's going into the general fund. So if you just do the math, if the personal income tax is 70% of the general fund revenue, and the top 1% of taxpayers are controlling half of that, that means that fully one third of the state's general fund budget is impacted by just 1% of the taxpayers in the state. And those people are highly, highly affluent, highly net worth individuals.
Yeah.
A lot of them living in those zip codes down in Silicon Valley, but other areas of the state as well. So this is why our tax revenue system is so volatile. When capital gains are doing good, the state's got lots of money.
Yep.
When capital gains aren't doing so good, the state's broke. And nobody has come up with an econometric model that can predict the ups and downs of capital gains in the out years.
Absolutely.
And the big mistake, just one last thing on this point, 3 years ago, I think it's right before you were elected, the governor told the legislature in the May revise that we had a $97 billion surplus.
I remember.
And he bragged at the time nationally that this was the largest state budget surplus in any state in the history of this country. And if it had ever turned up, it would have been. That $97 billion was a mirage. It never materialized. And the mistake that the governor and the legislature that time made 3 years ago is they built a budget with increases in health and human services, education, other areas, assuming that that money was going to show up and that a big chunk of it was going to be permanent. And so the reason why I talked to you earlier about the fish mouth and the fact that right now, systemically in the budget, expenditures are going faster than revenues. Why? It all goes back to 3 years ago when the governor and legislature went along with the Kool-Aid that said we had a $97 billion surplus, and it never materialized. That money never showed up in Sacramento. It was never collected by the FTB. And it's unfortunate, but we're still facing the hangover from that now.
Yeah, we're dealing with the after effects of that. Last note I'll make on the budget, too, is that the governor funded a lot of initiatives that were passed by the voters. Climate bond, there was the school bond, some of the other things that require funding passed by the voters. Really no talk about Proposition 36, and so which he obviously opposed last year. And so we will have to wait and see how that plays out as well in the discussions. Lots to talk about over the next few months as a legislature. I hope that the legislature really pushes back on the governor's priorities and figures out a way to, I think, really do what's best for our state. But time will tell on that. Any final thoughts before we let you go today? I want to get
Only
you out of
because
here.
you mentioned in the beginning. I will tell you, I share your concern about growing government and having more and more government to try to solve problems. I will try to assuage your concerns a little bit. I haven't seen all the details, and the little Hoover Commission will have to review the governor's reorganization plan. But I do think his Consumer Affairs Agency, it's largely going to be the Department of Consumer Affairs that's going to get renamed.
The Consumer Protection.
The Consumer Protection Agency.
Okay.
I think what he's really doing there, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing, I haven't seen the details, but he's elevating those functions, those boards and commissions that do all the professional licensings, the barbering and nursing and all the different things, healing arts, raising it up to cabinet level to make it an agency. So I'm not sure it means a lot of new bureaucracy, but it will give them higher status within his administration. And as far as the housing and homelessness goes, it's probably going to be HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and some other functions that get elevated up, and not necessarily a whole new bureaucracy.
And not additional, agencies on top of the existing
Now,
ones.
I may be wrong about that, but that's what it seems like.
And as I said, the devil's in the details. We'll wait to see on the details. I think, again, this governor a lot of times comes out with very big announcements and not as much follow through. And that is always something that has kind of been a trend in his administration. And so if there's ways to improve the output of homeless services in California, I'm all for that. And I would support that. But, I think I'm really interested to see, those final details.
Well, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to come on your podcast. I really enjoy when we have an opportunity to talk about these things. If your listeners and you have any desire to talk about the May revise in 5 months, I'm happy to come back and do that.
Well, I was just going to say, Tom, if you want to come back in May, we'd love to have you back and kind of talk about where things stand then, because I think that is really a lot closer to our budgetary deadline, which is June 15th. And much will look a lot more like what the budget will ultimately look like in the end. And so let's definitely put that on the calendar. Just a few announcements you might find interesting. We're back for 2025 Point of Order podcast. We'll continue to go strong. We're moving to 2 episodes a month instead of 4. And I think that's in large part due to just our desire to make the content even better, to make our, basically allow for even more robust conversations. And allow for more preparation. And so we're excited to kind of have that new order. But the other thing that I've done, and I thought you might find this interesting as someone that has to meet all these new people, we have over 30 new legislators this year in California. We are going to be inviting all of them to come on the podcast and introduce themselves this year.
That's great.
And so, not everyone's going to say yes, but whether you're a Republican or a Democrat new legislator, we're going to be inviting you on the podcast. Would love to have you on to talk about your district, to talk about what you want to work on in Sacramento, and really just to help everyone kind of get to know the people that are representing them in our state. And so that's going to be kind of the plan for this year, and we're excited for all the new guests we're going to have.
I think that's awesome. May I plug one thing very quick?
Yeah, please.
Just for those of you that didn't see this last month.
Oh, I like it.
The Sheehy Strategy Group published a guide to the new members of the California legislature. It's available in PDF format. If you just go to my website and go to the blog, you can download it. And Josh, if you don't have one of these, I'll send it over to your office later today.
I will open that today. What is the website? Can you give people the website?
It's www.sheehystrategygroup.com. That's SHEEHY strategygroup.com.
Love it.
And if you click on where it says news/blog, you'll see where it says new members of the legislature. You can download this guide. It's nice because it gives you who the member is, who they replaced. Like Megan Dolly, for example, obviously replaced her husband. Christopher Cabalden replaced
That's
Bill Dodd.
great.
It lets you know their partisan affiliation, where their offices are. It gives their bio, a district map.
Love it.
It's very, very handy. It's a great way to sort of quickly get up to speed about some of these new members.
Well, I actually am going to download that and bring it to these interviews so that I have a little background on all these people coming on. But we're really excited to hopefully have a good, bipartisan collection of legislators. We already have a number booked through the next few months. So
that's great.
We're really excited to get started on that. If you have any ideas for future shows, as always, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. And to follow today's host on X, myself at Joshua_Hoover, and I believe at Sheehy Strategy for your X account as well. And then you can always follow the podcast and all the socials at Point of Order Pod. But thank you, Tom, again for coming on. Look forward to seeing you back later this year.
Thank you. You're most welcome.